Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. This video is part of a series of videos entitled Questionable Witnesses, An Atheist Teaches Life of Christ. Today we're looking at Matthew 2, 1 through 12, where the Magi visit the child Jesus, and we are asking the question, did the Magi actually exist? I'm teaching the Gospels much like I did many times in my churches as a pastor over the years, but now I'm teaching it as an atheist. The whole issue of this series has been to get to how many witnesses do the Gospel accounts actually have, and are they credible? The Bible's low bar criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses is our first test. The next test is modern scholarship, which is a little bit more rigorous as to proving the truth or falsehood of claims with other criteria. Plus, I want to make any remarks about the story that I think are pertinent, and I also want to make some deconversion notes at the end. To summarize Matthew 2, 1 through 12, at the time Jesus was born in Bethlehem, some Magi came from the east to visit. They go to the palace of Herod the Great, who was king of Israel at the time, and ask where the newborn king of Israel is because they have come to worship him. This troubles Herod and all of Jerusalem with him. Herod gathers all the chief priests and inquires of them where the Messiah would be born, and they quote to him Micah 5:2, which says that he'd be born in Bethlehem. Herod tells the Magi this and asks them that when they have found the child to return to him so that he can also go and worship the child. The Magi go, and the star they have been following, which leads them to Jesus at a house in Bethlehem, and they present their gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They are warned in a dream not to return to Herod and go back to their country of origin another way. Starting with the Bible's own criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses, the story only appears in one place in all the literature of antiquity, here in Matthew 2, 1 through 12. That's it. And so the Bible fails once again to give us multiple accounts of an event or meet this very low bar criteria. Now, the story itself indicates many people would have been witness to many of the events, from Herod to the chief priest to all of Jerusalem, could have provided a lot of witnesses to the events, if they had bothered to write anything down, which none of them did. So even though there are a lot of potential witnesses to the story, no one bothers to even record such a supposedly well-known event that troubled the whole city. So the Bible fails again to meet its own criteria in multiple ways. The Gospels only have this in one place, and so we are left to turn to modern scholarship to see if it provides any insight into this story. But this unfortunately makes it worse. I want to focus on the Magi on this point, and we'll talk more about Herod's slaughter of the innocents on the next episode. But I want to point out that even the biblical scholars at this point have to do a lot of shrugging of shoulders when it comes to the question of who were the Magi. From the east is the only designation. So the country of origin could be anything east of Jerusalem. So you could wave your hand in the easterly direction if you were standing in Jerusalem. And that gives you Persia, India, China, etc. Take your pick. They are following a star, so this might indicate them being astronomers, astrology types. But the star itself is kind of funny. It seems to only generally get them to Herod's palace at first, and only later does it guide them specifically enough to find the child specifically in a house. No one at the time indicated any kind of astrological phenomena that would fit this star. It is in itself a subject of a large amount of speculation and conjecture. But that is true of almost this entire story. In fact, the only thing that really can be historically verified in this story is that Herod the Great actually existed. There really is nothing but speculation and conjecture about this story, so I guess I'm going to just add my own. The one thing that becomes very clear about the writer of Matthew is that he has an axe to grind with Herodians. These are the people that were claiming that Herod the Great was the Messiah and that he fulfilled a lot of these prophecies. This narrative was still continuing long after Herod the Great's death, and so Christians who wanted to prove that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah had to counter the Herodians, where they said that Herod the Great filled this role. This is the beginning of that narrative that Matthew is trying to present. And so Matthew starts with the Magi in the palace of Herod the Great, and that is very convenient if you're trying to build a narrative with an agenda in the ancient world where no one was going to bother to verify your account, and you were just propagandizing. The Magi are the biggest puzzle in this entire story, and the fact that more details aren't given about them, where we would have a more historical corroboration, is very telling. But the writer leaves them so vague as to who they were, they really only provide a literary device to drive the story. No country of origin, no details as to who they were. The star they followed is the same. with it basically seeming to only giving general direction and guidance when it comes to getting them to the palace of Herod the Great. But then all of a sudden becomes a very specific, like, will-o'-the-wisp that actually leads them to the child when they get to Bethlehem. The one thing the writer of Matthew does want to get across is that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and fulfilled Micah 5:2. But the way he does it leaves us wondering about a whole bunch of the elements of the story that surround that prophecy. One note people who are critical of the Bible story make is that this could have not happened all in one night. But the Gospels do not indicate they were done in one night. The one thing that sets this off is that that by the time the Magi arrive, the young couple is there in a house, indicating in the narrative all the Gospels, if you took them together. At bare minimum, this event takes place after Jesus is presented in the temple. I think also the word for infant and child are also different. Luke uses the idea of Jesus being an infant throughout the story that he presents, but Matthew here in this story calls it child, which indicates somebody who is older. Also, the actions of Herod the Great later kind of indicate that maybe the child is presented as being 2 years old or younger. So basically, Joseph and Mary have spent some time in Bethlehem, and now this story comes about. They have gone from no room in the inn to finding a house is indicative of a passage of time in any narrative that I have no trouble accepting, and as far as I'm concerned, reconciles the story. And besides, that's not where the real criticism of the story lies. The problem actually is that nothing else makes sense at all, unless you take the gospel for what it is, literature with an agenda. There's a recurring pattern in Matthew's writing. That is his desire to show Jesus was the Messiah, not Herod. But the earlier Gospel of Mark, which Matthew uses extensively later on, does not have a birth narrative, which requires the Messiah be born in Bethlehem. Matthew uses this story to put Jesus' origins in Bethlehem. He's also the only one to do so, other than Luke, who only mentions it passively and doesn't make reference to the prophecy. However, this has all the markings of a post hoc creation to fit a political religious narrative. The story, because it appears nowhere else, can be accused of being a complete fabrication to make the prophecy work post hoc, and there's really no way to defend against that accusation, because there is so much in the story that is not verified in any other work at all. I would also argue that the story has a lot of elements of mythology at the time. Mysterious strangers, the king who's an antagonist, etc. It's all there. In fact, I would say there's a high likelihood in my mind that this story is completely made up by Matthew, whoever the writer was, because that's the other problem. The writer of Matthew is anonymous, which, if this is a political religious agenda work, would make a lot of sense. In fact, that's kind of my accusation against all the Gospels, because they're so vague in who writes them and they don't directly say it. Because they do this, you could easily accuse them of trying to protect the writer from political repercussions, which indicates that maybe the Gospels are more political than religious, although back then politics and religion mixed so cohesively it was hard to pull them apart. But what I look at with this now is, as somebody who has done a lot of writing, I can see how this narrative is completely concocted. I would leave too, if I was trying to prove this prophecy and didn't want somebody to check my work, I would definitely make up characters like the Magi to be the narrative drivers. They drive the narrative of the story. It's all about their visit. And because of their visit, some of the implications that will happen later, which we'll see next time. I can see how you would keep, from the East is vague enough so you can have all these different wizards and whatever that filled Persia, India, China, Indonesia, all the rest. From the East is so vague, but, the trade routes did exist. And this is one of those things where I'm just like seeing a narrative being built by a writer. And that indicates to me a fabrication. The fact that the writer of Matthew is so adamant about attacking Herod in this story, and not just here, but later on, which we'll get to next time, indicates to me that he is willing to do a lot of things to drive that narrative. He's also willing to make the prophecies work. So this post hoc, getting the prophecies to work by writing narratives around them that fit maybe stories that, people, apologists of Jesus' life for decades had been telling. Because we know Matthew is written much later than Mark, and Mark at best is 70 AD, we that can be verified, we have this problem. So Matthew is writing as a second-generation Christian at best. And so he's taking narratives and trying to make them fit the prophecy and trying to counter the Herodians who are still around, claiming that Herod the Great was the Messiah and had fulfilled all the prophecies, and now they were just waiting for the return of God. So we have this whole narrative basis going back and forth. And as somebody who is a writer, I can see all the elements of a great story here. Don't get me wrong, it's kind of a fun story. You know, you have these mysterious strangers that show up in the palace of the king, who is the king, claiming that there's been born a king of the Jews, but Herod hasn't had anybody pregnant in a while. He's an old man by this time. And so what we end up with is a story that fits a certain narrative, what Matthew wants it to say. I can easily see how this would be a concoction, and I would accuse the writer of Matthew of concocting a story around a prophecy to fit a political religious agenda. And there's really no way to push back on me on that because of how poorly the history is in this story. There isn't any history here that we can look to say that I'm wrong in making that accusation. There's so much conjecture, so much speculation, even from biblical scholars on this event, as to what these magi were and what Herod the Great was doing at the time. I mean, at best, you have Herod the Great being a very, very old man at this point, because this is very much definitely at the end of his reign. And so he's not having children at this point. In fact, he already has a few that are problematic. And so he's kind of just an old man at this point, trying to hold on to his throne for a little bit longer so he can die in peace. And along come these magi saying there's another king. That would indicate a lot of political intrigue, which makes another part of a fascinating story. You have the Magi being warned of a dream to go a different way, so we have supernatural elements to the story. It's great stuff. There's absolutely no history that backs this story up. And so it's just a story that's plopped into our lives by the writer of Matthew, and we're left with that. I want to say at this point, from a deconversion point of view, this story was one of the first times that I realized that the gospel of writers could be absolutely making things up, and I had no way to push back against that idea as a Christian. It's one of the things that bothered me about this story was, you know, for an all-powerful, omniscient God, he doesn't seem to know what the criticisms of his gospels were going to be in the future. It's almost like the gospels were written by men and not inspired by God at all in order to fit certain political and religious narratives. By this time, the life of Jesus has become so much a product of, you know, we have this oral tradition that keeps repeating the stories and changing them. And so this is decades later by the time Matthew writes this down. And because of that, we're left with not much, you know, other than to speculate whether or not this story was even true. I always love it how, you know, apologists say, well, there wasn't enough time for stories to be concocted. And I literally know of urban legends that started 6 months after the events. There's literally human beings will make up all kinds of stories about an event that happened yesterday that isn't true. And yet somehow the apologist wants to magically think that this didn't happen with the Gospels. I'm sorry. Even if I took the early conservative dates that a lot of Christian biblical scholars put on these Gospels, that's still plenty of time for a whole bunch of things to be concocted, changed, and edited by the passage of oral tradition and time. And when we get to the real dates that I think are real about the writings of the Gospel, at best late 1st century, early 2nd, what we have is now a narrative that could have easily been edited and changed. And this story illustrates this so much. If I was going to write a political religious narrative, I would do it this way. Keep the protagonist, the Magi, vague. Keep Herod the bad guy, the well-defined bad guy who's up to something. You know, do it in such a way that it's very propagandized. And because there's no way to corroborate the story back then, it easily passes. And for decades and centuries, the story just is given a free pass as history without any critical thinking about it. But that's not happening anymore. And from a deconversion standpoint, this was the point that I realized that the writers of the Gospels could very much be making stuff up. They could be writing things that they just want to put in there. But also, by this time, the oral tradition, so many decades have passed, that the stories have been edited by, early apologetical attempts by the Christians to justify their beliefs and justify their stories, that we can't really even know the truth. And this story illustrates the mysterious not being able to know the truth of any of these accounts better than most. You just don't have any verification for any of this. And it's at that point, when you're a believer and you're deconverting, that the whole belief in the Bible being history and the inspired Word of God begins to fall apart. Because if it was actually inspired by God, it seems to me God would know the historical criticism of the 20th and 21st century and even earlier that the Gospels would face, and attempt to provide the evidence necessary so that criticism is shot down. But an omniscient God who supposedly inspired all this doesn't seem to do that. I would have to say at this point that what we have at best with the Gospels, particularly Matthew is going to do a lot of concoction to make the prophecies work post hoc. And that's the biggest problem with Matthew all the way through. His use of prophecy is demonstrated here as it's thrown in a narrative to kind of prove a point. And he does this often. But a lot of the times he will pull this out of context. Now, in this particular case, I don't think he necessarily does pull it out of context, because a lot of the Jews at the time believed this sort of thing, that the Messiah was definitely going to be born in Bethlehem, was something that was around the Messianic Jewish narrative. And so that's not anything new. The problem that was presented by Mark was, we don't have Jesus in Bethlehem at any time. And so Matthew comes along and creates a story that not only puts Jesus in Bethlehem, but also counters the Herodians. How convenient. How very, very convenient. But, that's my thoughts on this story. I'm sure there's much more I could say. I'm sorry for the frog in my throat, but I'm facing a cold right now. But I wanted to get this video out to point out that, once again, from a deconversion standpoint, for me, when I was studying the life of Christ, this story was so problematic. And on an emotional level, I suddenly realized there was no proof of this story at all. And that the Magi could be completely made up characters because they're so vaguely defined as to where their origin is, they could come from anywhere. It's like they're just dropped out of the blue to create a narrative, to prove a prophecy, and to make Herod look bad. I'd be interested in what you have to say about this. As I'm always with this series, I'm interested in your comments. As part of the Deconversion Bible study series that appears on Mondays, this is Questionable Witnesses will be out every other week. And so thank you for your time and everything. Hit the like button, share this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. There's many ways to support this channel, including direct donation through Super Chat, Super Thanks. My PayPal link is in the description. If you want to support my work to continue to normalize atheism and deconversion, that's the best way to do it. But, watching the video and doing the like is also very, very much a part of that as well. I want to give a hearty shout out to all members of the Rabyd Nation. By hitting that subscribe button, you become a part of that. But to become a citizen, of course, and become a member of the channel is the best way to support the channel. And so for those of you who are members, I give you a hearty shout out. Thank you very much to the citizens of the Rabyd Nation. You guys are awesome, and you make it much easier for me to focus on what I want to do instead of worrying about the YouTube algorithm all the time. So thank you very much. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. And so you want to take all your time, money, and opportunities and give them to yourself, the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do, and don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.